session is going to focus upon 5 things today. Firstly, we're going to talk about basics of adjudication. Secondly, we're going to talk about clashes and their importance. Thirdly, we're going to talk about opening half debates. Then we're going to talk about extensions, long and short cross, and then ultimately panel discussions, because I feel like a lot of people do need like sessions and panel discussions, especially because I've had like really bad experiences with like panels. And I just think it's important for this information to be out there. So firstly, for the basics, 4 things on the basics that are incredibly important. Firstly, every adjudicator that adjudicates a debate needs to remember that they're an average reasonable voter. What does that mean? So while there's a huge spectrum of, let's say, ideas out there, in terms of what an average reasonable voter is, we're just going to break that down into 2 things. Firstly, it's an individual who does not bring in like prejudged knowledge that they've had before the debate. So it does not matter if you're a bachelor's in, let's say, in computer science, if the debate happening at computer science and people are, let's say, absolutely like people are basically giving out information that you think is untrue, you do not necessarily have the right to disregard that information just because you feel like the information is just untrue to begin with. I think at the point at which you're an average reasonable voter, you judge the debate based on logic and you judge the debate based upon what's happening within the room itself. Meaning, if, for example, if there is a clash in which they have given you logical reasons as to why that clash is true, and that particular reason has not been rebutted by the other team, you as an adjudicator buy that clash because you're an average reasonable voter. But secondly, you're also a person who understands and knows issues. Now, this is slightly controversial because then people confuse it with the idea about that I should be simply able to like disregard knowledge. That's not exactly what this means. What it does mean is that for a like you're able to make minor, let's say, connections within logic, or they be able to decide that some sort of argument like they've made in later part of their speeches probably still coincides with the argument that they've made previously, or some, let's say, rebuttal that the prime minister has made in the first minute is actually a preemption of the argument that the LO is making in the 4th minute or something. The sort of connections you can make because you do understand as to how argumentation and stuff works. So these are the 2 very important things to remember when you enter a room, not to bring in like knowledge that's already there previously you have acquired before the room. But second and more importantly, you're able to perhaps like connect slight issues like things because you're an average reasonable voter. The second thing that's important for you as an adjudicator is the ability to reevaluate the speaker's argument. And the reason that this is extremely important is, I think judges more often than not just take arguments on face value and just based on the idea that since the speaker has said something, it probably is true, and that's how they buy it. There's a huge problem with that is because you don't essentially do the groundwork of ever understanding if like the argument that's been made has really necessarily been evaluated to the fullest degree or necessarily reaches the conclusion that the speakers claim that it does reach. At that particular point of time, it becomes really important for like adjudicators then to probably reevaluate like the speaker's argument or the arguments that have been making in the debate. What does that look like? For example, let's say an argument's broken down into like 4 parts. There's a huge there's a training guide that I've also mentioned in terms of like the anatomy of arguments. But first, the first important question that you need to ask is what essentially is the claim, i.e. what is the speaker trying to prove in the debate? And is that claim necessarily extremely relevant? I think a lot of speakers just give out arguments all the time. I think it's up to the ash to decide whether that argument necessarily holds the kind of relevance the speaker is perhaps telling you that it does. Secondly, is there reasoning within that argument to support that claim? Meaning, are there any, let's say, logical leaps that the particular speaker makes, or are there any particular, let's say, any particular like lapses within the kind of reasoning that the speaker is making? You should be able to identify the lapses within the reasoning. You should be able to identify the logical leaps. And then once you found out if there are logical leaps, you also need to do the determination of, are those really like, do they really harm the speech to the extent to which I necessarily discredit this argument? Or do they hurt the speech, they heard the argument in a minor way, and the argument is still viable to a certain extent? I think automatically if there is a logical leap, it doesn't make the complete argument invalid. So I think adjudicators there need to use the critical thinking in order to really like reason out if the sort of reasoning is really hurt because of what they are doing. The third thing, and I think it's really important, is figuring out what essentially the impacts of those arguments are, i.e. where are they trying to reach with that particular argument? What is the sort of difference from the status quo that they're trying to bring into the debate? And are they able to bring that? Once you're able to decide that, then perhaps you can move on to the idea of, now that they brought up the impact, now I'll probably measure in terms of like, Is this particular impact really is like extremely, really like important and relevant within the debate, and probably position it within the other houses in terms of how the debate goes. But second, and more importantly, also probably argue if this impact here is exclusive and really weighed out within the debate. What does it essentially look like? For example, if you're bringing in a certain argument, if you bring in certain impact within the debate, it's also important for you to say, is this impact really exclusive from the status quo? Or is this really different from what the opposition could have perhaps brought up in the debate? If it's not, then the relevance of that argument is severely lowered within the debate. And this, so therefore buying becomes extremely difficult. So you also have to constantly weigh it out against the counterfactual that is coming in from that opposition. And if the seeker has really done the groundwork in order to really prove that the argument's exclusive, that the argument perhaps has exclusive benefits, and if those benefits are really worth it within the debate in terms of the change they bring in terms of the status quo. If they're able to do that, that's a valid contribution within the debate. And therefore you can perhaps then begin to weigh the debate in terms of who wins in clashes. The third thing important to remember is fairness. And I've seen a lot of Adjs do this, and it's really annoying. I.e., for example, if you get a motion where an Adj believes that the motion perhaps favors one side more than the other, they'll now begin to perhaps credit the side that it's not favoring a lot more, saying that, oh, but then they couldn't have done anything more within the debate, or I can't come up with arguments for that particular side. Therefore, what they're saying perhaps deserves a little more credit. The problem with that sort of thinking is that it's not a judge's job within the debate to ensure that motions are balanced. And that's why there's a CAP panel, right? I think at a point at which the motion is given to you, it becomes then important for you to then judge the debate, how the debate has been perhaps played out in terms of the rule. And therefore not just and then don't begin to, let's say, credit one team more or credit one team less just because of your perception of what the motion perhaps favors. Because in most cases, it's, and a CAP panel tries their best to ensure that the motions are balanced. And since most of us have, let's say, we lie on a spectrum of experiences in terms of how we look at motions, or even, let's say, our comfort factor with different types of motions, we aren't able to see one side more, or in most cases, we aren't able to say, let's say, see arguments, all the arguments that could have been made from one side or the other. So at that particular point of time, if you begin to then perhaps test the motions out for fairness and begin crediting or discrediting a speaker, it becomes extremely difficult for you to then become a good Adj, because then you always within your OA, you will sound unfair to teams, and therefore you will be marked down. So at any point of the debate, have the same objective metric for both teams and weigh them upon the same burdens that you weigh one or the other. You can't essentially have different burdens for different teams depending on what the motion is. The last thing that's important, and this is constructives. And I think the reason that I kept this here is because a lot of Adjs that I've probably have asked me for questions also often I end up asking, how do you really give constructive to speakers? And I think the problem then becomes when you're Adjing debaters who you think are better debaters than what you are into if you perhaps would have spoken or debated. At that particular point in time, people just feel really uncomfortable in terms of dishing out constructives. The problem with that sort of thinking is, if you are uncomfortable in terms of giving constructives, you never really learn how to give constructives in the first place. And since for a lot of debaters, the only sort of feedback that they ever receive in terms of how to get better is in terms of Adj constructives, it is a really, really important part of what the adjudication process should be. And I think we should just spend a lot more emphasis on constructives. Even current tournaments, I've seen a lot of Adjs just not apply for constructives just because they're afraid of it. The way in which you perhaps improve in constructives is, and this is a mesh of a few things that we've discussed. That is, firstly, if you're critical of, let's say, arguments, and you constantly, let's say, weighing arguments out in terms of, has the reasoning been enough? Has the impact of this argument been enough? Have the claims been justified? You're more often than not able to come up with some sort of, let's say, reason as to why the team perhaps wins or loses the debate. The second way in which you perhaps can do this is, and this might be slightly controversial, but I generally think that Adjs should do this. That is, when you get the motion, you also should perhaps think about what cases can be run. Now, this don't take this idea as you having a predisposed notion of expecting this out of the teams, but at least if you are able to perhaps think about what exactly teams would have run in this debate, what you would have run in this debate, you more or less have the idea about what burdens are there on teams within the debate. And you're not thinking about that while teams are speaking. Hence, you're not, let's say, missing out on what teams are saying in the debate. I.e., it becomes easier for you to then engage because you're better able to perhaps just listen to arguments and buy arguments, because you're not doing as much thinking now from the ground up to believe what exactly teams are saying. But secondly, you have a better idea of burdens. So you also have a better idea of what teams perhaps have to fulfill in order for their arguments to make sense. And then just give out constructives. Like when I started out, I just gave out constructives to anyone, and most of my constructives didn't make sense. But then eventually over time, they will begin to, because then you'll begin, like you'll grow in experience in terms of the kind of tournaments you're Adjing, in terms of the rooms that you're Adjing, and the kind of critical thinking that you're doing every single time that you're Adjing. At that particular point of time, it becomes a lot more easier for you to give constructives. So basically just start wherever you can, but also just listen to arguments better, have expectations, then don't let those expectations just trickle down into your OA or verdict. Have expectations in terms of their fulfillment of their burdens, in terms of their extent of analysis, in terms of what them impacting certain arguments, in terms of also like if they've proved necessarily counterfactual or not. Do you have any questions at this point? Just gonna wait for like a couple of seconds. Any questions at all? The basics.
How to weigh in factual inaccuracies in arguments? Like at times I know factual inaccuracies are not that relevant, but still at times the premises.
Your voice is slightly muffled. I can't hear you. I'm so sorry. Can you type it out?
Yeah. How to weigh in factual inaccuracies in arguments? Like how to just consider them?
So factual, there's two ways to deal with this. Firstly, this is two ways to look at this. Firstly, factual inaccuracies don't really play a huge role when it comes to general sort of debating. Let's say if it's just an example, right? It's always, I think the idea is always about, does this example necessarily support the logic, or has there been, let's say, logical reasoning as to why the claim is true? If there is logical reasoning, I don't think there is a huge amount of value that's added within the debate just based on examples. So therefore, since you can't run arguments simply based on examples, they just aren't as relevant within debates. But secondly, in terms of debates which require spec knowledge, for example, let's say IR debates or economics debates and stuff, the way in which the best practice for you to go by is, if a team sets up a characterization using factual, let's say, ideas in terms of, let's say, what exactly does the world look like? And if the other team does not rebut it, but you as an Adj know that that's factually incorrect, you still buy that in terms of how the debate goes. But then you can perhaps deduct marks in terms of speaker points, or you perhaps can later talk about teams in terms of constructives, that this is probably what the status code looks like, not exactly what you said. But since the other team didn't necessarily point it out, I can't point it out as well. And therefore you still win, but then it's not true what you said. That perhaps is usually the best way to go about it in terms of judging factual inaccuracies when it comes to, let's say, characterization of like debates that require a huge amount of spec knowledge. In general debates, it's just, if a team is simply using an example to perhaps carry forward an argument, in most cases, just look at the logic behind that example. And if that logic essentially is sound. Can you explain the concept of a counterfactual in a bit of a detail too? Sure. Yeah, look at the logic behind that particular argument and see if that logic is sound, and if that reasoning is sound, and if there are any lapses within that reasoning. If there aren't, then you buy that argument. Even though, let's say, the team points out that the example is wrong, in most cases, examples just don't add, let's say, a lot of value within the debate. All they do is to show that, sure, this happens in the real world too, which essentially doesn't do a lot. Does it answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Wonderful. Can you explain the concept of a counterfactual in a bit of a detail too? So counterfactuals within debate simply means what exactly is the status, what exactly does the status quo of the world look like in case, like in the viewpoint of the opposition. So for proposition, the counterfactual is what is the opposition painting the world to be. For opposition, the counterfactual is what is the proposition painting the world to be. That's exactly what the idea of a counterfactual is. So whenever you're making some argument, you always need to perhaps compare that argument to the counterfactual or to whatever the world that the opposition is giving you, to show that this is exactly why we're better off exclusively from side opposition. And since these are reasons as to why we're better off than fight opposition, this is why we should win the debate, because of the individual contribution. If you're unable to do that, and if you're unable to show, let's say, exclusivity within your own arguments, there's a huge chance that the debate becomes messy, and there's a huge chance that the adjudicator then might perhaps use their own reasonings in terms of what is the end impact of your argument, and is it really relevant? In most cases, you don't want to leave it to the adjudicator, you want to do that yourself. And that's why our counterfactuals become extremely important within debates, like assessing counterfactuals become really important. Any other questions?
There's one in the chat.
Yeah, I answered that. I answered that right now. Perfect. So we'll just move on to the next part, is clashes. Now, what exactly are clashes within debate and why they're important? So clashes basically are questions that you can perhaps like reduce the debate down into. And this is extremely important. The reason for that is it puts the whole debate into perspective for you in terms of what things perhaps are relevant within the debate and what things aren't. And initially, I didn't used to use clashes a lot. I used to give a general summary in terms of how the debate went. And the moment I started using clashes and using questions to perhaps like put the debate into perspective, debating just became a whole lot easier, like adjudicating just became a whole lot easier. And especially like even easier to like explain to people in terms of why did I come to the conclusion that I did, which essentially means a lot of debaters within, let's say, a lot of adjudicators that I've like asked with, especially like novice adjudicators, they tell me that, oh, a team should perhaps win the debate because they had a principle, and the principle is extremely important. That's why they should like win, which in most cases doesn't do enough to ever justify if the contribution of the team necessarily has been relevant. But what do clashes do is you break down the debate into subparts or sub questions where the clashing has been done between the two teams. For example, let's just take a random motion, okay? For example, this house would ban smoking. Let's take the most basic example. The primary clashes, if the principles have been given in terms of government has come up to you and told you there's an obligation that the government has in order to ban smoking because of the entire thing about principles in terms of like people to have the rights and stuff. The question there is then, what exactly is the obligation of the government towards the people? Now, the thing is, if it's a novice adjudicator, they look at it and they say, but a principle has been given since you had valid contribution. But simply answering the question that the government has an obligation to do this probably doesn't do justice to the debate in terms of giving you, let's say, an absolute contribution of you completely winning the debate, even if the other team has given you reasonable impacts. And that's how you put it into perspective, right? That is, the team has proved to me that there is an obligation, that there is a need from the government to perhaps do this. But secondly, they now need to perhaps tell me as to how does it perhaps benefit the society or benefit different stakeholders within the debate. And then you break it down into, let's say, further sub questions within it. I think it just helps a lot in terms of putting the whole debate into context in terms of 2 or 3 questions that become extremely important questions. And the way in which it secondly benefits you in terms of your adjudication is, it also helps you to understand what material do you regard and what material do you disregard. That is, in few questions, what teams do is, like they don't weigh out the debate a lot. I.e., they tell you as to what the side of the debate is, but they're never able to tell you as to how does it essentially weigh out against the counterfactual that is from the other side, from the opposition. But secondly, what exclusive burden do they bring in? Meaning, in like for parallel debates, right? So you can basically, in terms of justifying parallel, in terms of like justifying the particular clash, is to say that the key for first question of this debate was, what exactly is the obligation of the state towards the people? Proposition gave me 2 ideas, A, B. Opposition gave me 2 ideas, A and B. Neither prop nor op were ever able to tell me in this debate as to why is that idea A a lot more relevant than the other side. But secondly, why is the stakeholder perhaps a lot more important? At a point at which they weren't able to do that, it becomes really difficult for me to give it to one side or the other. And therefore, the first clash for me is a wash. Then the next 2 questions become incredibly important for me in terms of judging the debate. It just makes your whole process, the entire like process you went through as an adjudicator, a lot more easier to explain to teams rather than just telling them, oh, but then your argument like clash with that particular argument. And since those arguments like you'd never really rebut the other argument, I wouldn't buy the positive material that you gave me. It would never make sense to a team if I told them like this without essentially like breaking the debate down into clashes and telling them as to what questions they answer or not. And hence, clashes become incredibly important for you, is to just break the debate down into questions. Probably talk about the other team's able to tell me if there is an obligation from actor X to do Y, whatever the motion requires. Secondly, how do you benefit perhaps the primary stakeholder? Secondly, how do you benefit the secondary or tertiary stakeholders within the debate? And are they able to tell me, like, are they able to ever tell me as to the impacts essentially are valid to the extent that they want to? So that's how clashes and the importance as to why perhaps breaking down into clashes really helps. The next thing that we're going to talk about is opening half debates. And this is extremely important in BP. So in BP, a lot of people, once they come in to judge BP, British parliamentary debates, they're really confused because they see 4 teams and they have no idea as to how do you perhaps weigh out the 4 teams and how do you give them rankings. The way that I judge in BPs and the way that I've essentially like arranged things here too is the first thing to do within British parliamentary debate is when the debate is happening is to figure out who wins in the opening half. And this is the easiest way in which you can judge British parliamentaries. Figure out who wins the opening half. If it's either opening government or is it opening opposition. And remember, this ranking doesn't change for you, like regardless of what the closing teams do. I.e., if the OG wins over opening opposition at the end of opening opposition's arguments, at the end of DLO, you're sure and you have reasonings that like opening government wins over opening opposition. This ranking will not change irrespective of what the closing government says and what the closing opposition says in the debate. I.e., let's say OG wins over opening opposition, it's either opening government first, opening opposition fourth, or can range into like opening opposition second, opening government second, opening opposition third. The rankings never flip. And what that helps you to do is that helps you to state essentially have a baseline in terms of saying that, sure, this team loses against this team. Now let's look at the closing contributions within the debate. And then you begin to measure out, does closing government win over opening government? Yes, no. Does closing government win over opening opposition? Yes, no. Do the same with closing opposition. At the end of it, you'll have a ranking which more or less just like makes sense. And then you can have a panel discussion and probably sort like the things out. But in most cases, there's a way in which you perhaps helps you the most. So 4 questions in terms of judging the opening half. And judging the opening half is like, it's like similar to judging a 3v3 debate. If you ever judge it, it's literally the same basic principles that you apply towards any team in terms of judging them and in terms of seeing if they have won the debate. 4 questions you ask yourself. Firstly, are they able to prove an obligation within the debate about actor X doing whatever they want to? Is that obligation really as relevant within the debate as they want it to be? How important is this? So this can range from motion to motion. If this motion talks about principles in an extremely, let's say, in an extremely specific manner, like it's a THBT believes that this should be done, then probably the principles gain, the obligations, the reason that they talk about as to why X should be done probably has a lot more value within the debate. If it's basically, let's say, a policy debate or an IR debate or debate in which you perhaps prioritize tangible impacts a lot more, then the principles don't necessarily have, let's say, gain that much footing. So that sort of reasoning is important for you to do and also for the teams to do in terms of telling you as to why their arguments are perhaps relevant and important. The second thing to ask yourself is, have they really proved tangible impacts to me? That is, does that argument really ultimately translate towards anything in terms of giving me a proper reasoning as to why things perhaps should be done, and is there really a noticeable change in the status quo or a noticeable change from the opposition's world? If yes, then you then go on to the next 2 questions. If they haven't given you any tangible impacts, then probably they don't do a lot to change the status quo. And if they haven't done a lot to change the status quo, it severely weighs down upon the contribution that they're making to the debate, which means that the team in most cases is weaker when it comes to, let's say, a different side, which perhaps has given you tangible impacts and has given you like very specific changes in terms of why the status quo is benefited or harmed. If they've given you tangible impacts, then the next 2 questions probably are those impacts really weighed against the opposition in terms of showing exclusivity of those impacts, in terms of showing that there is exclusive essentially contribution from the other side in terms of the impacts? Secondly, have they really shown the relevance and the importance of the stakeholder to whom they're giving certain impacts? I.e., this house would ban cigarette debate. Sure, you can tell me that it probably hurts, let's say, tobacco farmers or necessarily their families And essentially that essentially is bad. And the other team can tell me, but smoking hurts people and their families and like passive smokers and active smokers. If it becomes extremely important for the teams to then justify as to why the stakeholder is more important than the other. What is the reason because of which you perhaps prioritize one stakeholder over the other, given that they've both given me active impacts in terms of how like certain sections of the population are hurt. At that particular point of time, they need to show you the relevance and they need to show you the weighing, like they need to perhaps weigh out what stakeholder is important and why. If they're able to do that, that argument gains a lot more credibility in terms of you crediting that argument. If they're not, the argument goes lower down your priority list in terms of the arguments that you perhaps credit within the debate. At the end of this, you probably should have an answer towards either opening government or opening opposition has an upper hand in terms of the opening half of the debate. And this is how I also start my OA with also. Like I always start my OA talking about why perhaps what is the rankings within the opening half and why the rankings are the way they are. And then I bring in the other teams. It just makes it a lot more simpler for everyone to follow as well. Do we have any questions about this at all? Is there a slide about the 4 questions? No, I was told 10 minutes ago that I need to give this presentation with the presentation started. So I have absolutely no time to like make slides about this. I'm so sorry. But if you want me, I can repeat it. Would you want me to repeat it? Yeah, basically you talk about, are they able to prove essentially an obligation as to why a certain action has to be taken that the motion requires you to take? This obligation is probably mostly like it is a principle within the debate. And this principle perhaps loses its credibility or gains its credibility depending upon the kind of motion that you're perhaps engaging in. And then you perhaps talk about, have they able to like have these teams perhaps been able to prove tangible impacts within the debate? If they're able to prove those tangible impacts, then 2 questions. Firstly, are their impacts really weighed against the opposition team in terms of them being these impacts being exclusive and these impacts essentially having very direct contribution towards changing lives or towards bringing any sort of delta within the debate in terms of change to the status quo, good or bad, depending on proposition or opposition. If they're able to also tell you that their impacts are exclusive and their impacts benefit a certain stakeholder, then they need to tell you the relevance and the importance of that stakeholder. The very easy way to start, like perhaps like understand this is to talk about, for example, the cigarettes debate. Who do you like shutting down, say like banning cigarettes probably hurts tobacco farmers, but not banning it hurts people who smoke and passive smokers. So if both teams give you the arguments that, bro, like we've impacted these stakeholders X and Y, they also need to tell you as to why X is relevant or why Y is relevant. If they're unable to do that, then at that particular point of time, if they're unable to prove you the relevance of it, then the argument loses a lot of credibility against a team who is able to tell you as to why the stakeholder is important within the debate and perhaps should be credited. And I think that's where it becomes important for you to weigh that out. But I think the final thing to consider here is, what if none of the teams essentially give you any sort of mechanisms to assess credibility, essentially the importance of the stakeholder in the first place? I think that's when debates, that's when adjudicators, that's a point at which adjudicators dread the most, which is they probably need to decide it for themselves, which is perhaps the most important stakeholder within the debate and which isn't, which is a more tertiary stakeholder within the debate, depending upon just the extent of reasoning that teams are given in terms of the extent of impacts. So, and I think this becomes incredibly tricky for like adjudicators to do, and also incredibly tricky for you to then convince debaters that is a fair thing to do. But I think you here need to convey it firsthand. That is, you did expect the debaters to perhaps do this sort of weighing and do tell you as to why the like stakeholders ought to be prioritized. At a point at which they weren't able to do so, the only sort of result that you had at the end of perhaps their arguments is for you to then decide yourself who perhaps is impacted the worst within the status quo. And depending upon, let's say, who is impacted less or more, if they're both impacted, let's say, equally, then it becomes a subjective call. That is, who is perhaps the most central stakeholder within the debate, or what is the scale of harm? I think once you then talk about that, it becomes easier for you to then weigh it out. Just going to repeat it once again because it got a little messy. You think about 2 things. Firstly, you think about where is the impact more, i.e. who's able to tell me what stakeholder is worse off within the debate, depending upon that you can do it. Secondly, you think about where is the scale of harm greater or lesser? Where do you impact greater number of people? Where is just the harm a lot more greater than the other? Once you do that, then you can probably make a subjective call of which stakeholder was perhaps more important or less important within the context of the room that you were judging. I often and I'll discourage you to take this call yourself without answering these two questions, because then it's just incredibly subjective. And what grounds would anyone have to say that, let's say, tobacco farmers are not as important in the debate as, let's say, the people who smoke, right? So for this, you need to answer at least these questions in terms of the impact, and then secondly, in terms of the scale of harm that you're applying here. Is there any question about opening half debate or about anything that I've said so far? Okay, seeing none, we move on to the next part of the debate, which essentially is extensions and assessing extensions. So I think this is perhaps the most controversial part, or the trickiest part that adjudicators find is assessing extensions. People who are new to BP just find it extremely difficult for them to just assess extensions and recognize what essentially is extension and what isn't. In a more broad overview, if you just talk about very surface level idea what extensions are, anything new within the debate is an extension. Doesn't mean it's a valuable extension, but it is an extension. It is a new contribution brought up by the closing. So whenever adjudicators are assessing extensions within the debate, it's important for you to first think about what exactly is the unique contribution that this particular speaker is making within the debate. And once you've figured out what that unique contribution is, the second and the more important question for you to then answer is, what additional value does this bring to the debate? And this is extremely important, because then that tells you if that extension really is worth it, or is it simply just it's a new material that is brought up in the debate by the speaker, and then you don't know how to weigh it. So for example, let's just look at two cases to clarify this. The first case is a member comes up to speak. Member has the same premise that the opening government speaker had. They have the same end impact that the opening government speaker had, but they had the different reasoning as to why that impact comes from premise towards the impact. So they give you different reasoning in the between, but then they reach to the same conclusion, and they started from the same starting assumption the speaker reached. That's case one. Second case is member starts from the same premise. They start off with the same reasoning, but then the reasoning just branches off to a different stakeholder within the debate, and they're able to tell you as to why that stakeholder is a lot more important than what the opening government gave to you, and hence they're able to tell you as to how do you affect this stakeholder and why should we care about this sort of effect. In both of these cases, both of these teams have extensions. You cannot say the one team has extension and the other doesn't. I think at a point at which you prove that both teams do have extensions within the debate, at that particular point of time, you need to ask yourself, what extension is perhaps more valuable than the other? What additional value do they bring to the debate coming in from closing government? For case A, if the team just gives me additional reasons and comes to the same impact, sure, that's an extension, but does it really strengthen the argument that's coming in from side opening government? Or does it really make the debate any more better than what it was in the opening half? At a point at which it doesn't, probably that extension isn't a lot more relevant, because even without whatever they've said, the debate would still be exactly the same. So if you come to that conclusion, then it becomes difficult for you to then say that extension was perhaps worth it. So the way in which you talk about the teams is you tell them that the new, we had three key extensions coming in from closing government, A, B, and C. For the first extension, I wasn't able to credit you as much as you'd want to. The reason is because opening government has the same premise, they have the same conclusion. At a point at which they have the same premise, same conclusion, we want from closing government to come with an additional value contribution within the debate. And that cannot happen at a point at which you simply give me, let's say, a new layer of reasoning, meaning even if the layer of reasoning is true, it doesn't do anything to make the argument more worth, like make the argument, let's say, better in any way. It doesn't impact more people. It doesn't come from necessarily a different sort of assumption. It doesn't do anything within the debate to make it better. At a point at which it doesn't, the relevance of the impact is severely lost, and therefore I can't credit it as much. And then you move on to the other extensions they have talked about. And this is extremely important in the debate, because then you're able to compare contributions that the teams have made like within themselves. Once you've decided what exactly is the extensions in the debate in terms of what the teams have told you, and if those extensions are worth it, and if the extensions are valuable, at that particular point of time, you then do a bench comparison within, let's say, that sort of half in itself. And I feel a lot of Adjs just start off with comparing the team to other teams. I think first is extremely important for you to just do a bench comparison and see who wins among the benches. And again, this does not change no matter whatever the diagonals are within the debate. So you've decided what the opening ranking is after the opening half debate. Now you're deciding what the bench ranking is. If CG has more contribution in the debate than OG, or if CO has more contribution in the debate than opening opposition, what they gave you individually from their side, does it bring a lot more value within the debate? If it doesn't, and if the value isn't more than what the arguments that have been brought up by the opening, then you perhaps don't essentially, you perhaps can't give them the debate. So this sort of ranking perhaps has to be done. At a point which you're able to assess that, you move on to the next thing, which is the long and the short cross within the debate. For people who aren't aware of the terminology long and short cross, it just means the diagonals that exist within the debate. The longest diagonal that is in the debate is from opening government to closing opposition. That's the longest cross. The shortest diagonal that exists within the debate in terms of the speeches is opening opposition to closing government. That's the shortest cross in the debate. And the way in which I assess long and short cross is I look at individual contributions that have come in from both the closing sides in terms of the extensions that they've brought in and their own unique value towards their extensions. Then I compare that to whatever the argument had been brought up by the team on the diagonal, that is either opening opposition for closing government or opening government for opening opposition, and see what exactly the burdens were, or what did the teams need to prove to perhaps take a win over opening government. If the teams have perhaps proven something that perhaps is able to grant them a win over the other team in terms of them fulfilling the burdens that have been thrown out of them by opening government or opening opposition, then the teams on closing government and closing opposition win the debate. If they aren't able to do that, then it becomes difficult for you to then go on and perhaps award them the debate in terms of their own individual contribution. So always remember to do the sort of reasoning, do the sort of reasoning in debate in terms of why perhaps the long cross and the short cross works. The way in which I see a lot of people adding BPs, and is a way in which I was taught originally in Nepal too, when we were perhaps doing adjudication in Nepal, and I hadn't moved abroad to adjudicate, hadn't moved to university in India and stuff, is we decided who came first, we decided who came second, we decided who came third, who came fourth. And in the reasonings, we know why third wins over fourth. We know why second wins over third. We know why first wins over second, but we're never able to tell you as to why first wins over third or why second wins over fourth. And the way in which you perhaps can do that in debate is to just analyze every sort of clash that you can. You analyze the opening half clash, you analyze the bench clash, and then you analyze the diagonals. And the way in which you present the debate is, I think the simplest way, the way in which I do, is just in the manner of how the debate takes place. You tell them who won in the opening half. You tell them why closing half wins over opening government. You tell them as to why closing government wins over opening opposition. You bring in closing opposition. You tell them as to why closing opposition wins on the bench against opening opposition. And then you tell them as to why closing opposition wins or loses either against the entire bench or against individual teams on opening government and closing government. Trust me, it's doable once you start to get used to it. It's a lot more doable. And it just makes things so much more clearer for teams in terms of giving them an understanding of why the debate rankings are the way they are. Because if you don't do that, there's always questions from teams because they never really understand as to why they lost against that particular team. And because you haven't done that, you'll always get marked low, or you'll always see that the teams marking you low. And I just perhaps go on to say that, oh, the teams were an asshole. Well, probably let's say your OA should have been a lot more comprehensive in terms of telling you as to what exactly the clashes are. So the questions to ask in long and short cross. First, what exactly is the burden that is set by the team within the opening opposition or opening government? Are those burdens fulfilled by the other teams in terms of either their engaging material, that is the rebuttals that they make, or in terms of the positive matter within the debate? Are the problems that they've been raised by the opening government or opening opposition solved? If the opening team, if, for example, let's say the opening opposition has lost out to opening government, and for opening, who wins over who, bench clash, yep, exactly. Thank you so much for putting that in the chat. Honestly, helps a lot. So yeah, once you're able to, I was saying, right, if let's say your closing opposition and opening opposition has lost against opening government, then the sort of burdens become a lot more important for closing opposition to justify within the debate, which is to say, why perhaps closing opposition answers all of those questions that opening opposition isn't able to. If they aren't able to answer the same questions, then under no reasoning can you give the debate to closing opposition over opening government. Then you'll probably have to have opening government win over both the teams. But if opening opposition wins over opening government, and there aren't necessarily a lot of questions that are standing, or a lot of burdens that are still standing within the debate, closing opposition still does have some sort of, let's say, responsibility within the debate still to answer the same burdens that were raised out by opening government. But the way in which you perhaps weigh that, or the way in which you perhaps give credit to those sort of burdens, are a lot lower lesson now than they would have been if opening opposition would have perhaps lost. So on teams, it's extremely important for you to just make sure, and every single point of time, think about what exactly are the questions that have been raised up by the sides in opening, and how exactly do you nullify those? Because you never know if your opposition opening loses or wins based upon their argument, because most of the time you're busy writing your own speeches and you haven't listened to the debate properly. But please listen to the teams when the opposition teams in the opening are giving their speeches. I think once you're able to do that, it then becomes extremely important for you to then, it becomes really easy for you to then clarify as to what happens on a diagonal. And I think at the end of this, it's simple. So once you're done with from the opening half through to the diagonals, once you do all of these things, it's just the rankings become so obvious to you that it's you probably can justify your rankings in the best way possible, because you possibly see there's no other way in which the ranking should have been the way in which. And that also helps you just strengthen a lot of your reasonings in terms of why the rankings are the way they are, in terms of justifying them to teams, or if you're on the panel, justifying them to the panel. How long should an OA last? Depends. So it depends from format to format and from, let's say, the organized, the tournament as well. So APs mandate you that it's 7, don't exceed 715. In BPs, we give a lot more leeway to the chairs, because there are a lot more teams, a lot more clashes to deal with. So we raise that number to, let's say, 10 to 12 minutes. But I've had rooms where the OAs have gone on for 30 minutes, 35 minutes. I've had rooms where the OAs have ended 5 to 10 minutes. It's usually upon the ORCOM to probably set a time limit, depending upon what their schedule is. But if you're asking me as to if there is a blanket rule in terms of how long an OA should last, there is no blanket rule. So more often than not, the ORCOM will tell you previously that OA should not last, or should not exceed this amount of time, and panel discussion should not exceed this amount of time. Once you're able to do that, then you don't just exceed that time. But there is no blanket rule in terms of how long should it be. Ideally, you don't want to lose interest of teams. So try to wrap it up, say, in 10 to 12 minutes. No one listens to a 20-minute OA, really, honestly, if I'm telling you. But try to wrap it up in 12 minutes, but there is no hard and fast rule. You can take as long as you want, unless and until there isn't the OC telling you otherwise. In the diagonal engagement analysis part from the burden fulfillment, what were the other two questions? The questions that you have to answer is, are they able to, let's say, fulfill the burdens from the teams that the teams have perhaps thrown up to them? And the way in which you analyze burdens is, just think about if a team has perhaps raised a certain question, that is, if a team has said that we benefit this stakeholder the most, and we think the stakeholder is the most important, the implicit burden upon the other team is to prove either that the benefits don't exist to the extent to which the other team is claiming it to be, or if the benefits do exist, on the counterfactual, we have better benefits, or we have more severe benefits coming from our side. So the burdens are usually very clear in the debate in terms of what you need to do to win over that particular argument, to win over that particular sort of team. The way in which it's clearer to judges is, I've again asked you to use the clash method. Just break the debate down into questions. Once you do that, it will become really like clear to you that these are the set of questions that this team needs to answer if they want to win the debate. If they aren't able to answer that, they possibly can't. And again, we've also talked about how we weigh that in case, let's say, the opening has lost or opening has won the debate coming forward. Cool. We'll talk about the next thing, which is panel discussions. And the reason I feel like a lot of people, because like if there is 8 rooms in the tournament, there are 8 chairs, but there are like a heck lot more panelists. And I feel like a lot of people who panel just don't necessarily have adequate idea in terms of how to best panel, because a lot of people don't talk about it. The reason this is important is there's 2 things that you need to remember here. Firstly is when you're paneling against, like when you're paneling for any particular debate, always be concise in terms of why you think a particular clash goes to one team or the other. Usually a chair will ask you, explain to me as to why do you think what happens on the diagonal or what happens in the opening half of the debate? Why do you think opening government wins over opening opposition? Try to be as concise as possible. And the way in which we can be concise as possible is don't repeat the arguments that the teams have made. So don't be like, oh, the team gave me 3 arguments, A, B, and C. Probably the adjudicator already knows that. So rather than talking about what the team said and to what extent they said it, try to then talk about why your reasonings were the way they were. So on team's first argument about the principle X, Y, and Z, I thought this is why I think like this in this particular clash, and they win the debate. On this particular clash, they win the debate. Keep it as concise as possible, because panels usually happen on a very strict timeline. That is, panel discussions need to be over by a certain point. So if you're not concise by then, most probably a chair will just ask you to stop, or will just rush over the other motions, like rush over the other clashes in the debate. And then at the end of it, you'd probably get being marked low because you didn't contribute really like towards making that towards making the panel discussion as efficient as possible. For you to be able to have a good panel discussion, it's not just important for you to talk, but it's also important for you to have a conversation with the chair in terms of what do they think of this particular clash. So it's not just, I think the team should have perhaps won. It's, this is my reasoning as to why I think the debate should have happened. Why do you think otherwise? Or what do you think is your perhaps ranking or your reasoning? And the chair will perhaps in most cases tell you as to why do they think one way or the other. If they agree to you, that they agree with you that your reasoning is fine, you're safe, great, good job. I hope that your reasoning was sound, as good as the chair's reasoning is. If they don't agree with you, and this is what a lot of panelists do, if they say, yeah, okay, I understand it now. Like I understand why your reasoning was cool. And that's where they end it. Never end your reasonings, like never end the panel discussion by just accepting what the other person has said without ever giving a reason as to why you change your verdict. If you change a verdict during a panel discussion, always give a reason. Always say, oh, initially, the reason that I gave the panel like this particular clash to this particular team was because of X, but because you said that, and I take that into consideration, I now understand that like this has happened and this is why I changed my ranking. It just gives a lot more clearer picture to the Adj in terms of saying that, oh, this is a person who understands to how the debate functions, and hence is a person who deserves a higher score, rather than a person who simply just changes their verdict because the chair said so. If you're able to, like, if you do that, you feel like you've done the chair a favor in terms of saving time, but you're not doing yourself a favor in terms of the kind of scores that you want within that. The second thing to always remember is never really read, like have, let's say, just one paper in which you take notes that you read from. That is, if you're in a panel discussion, the worst thing that you can do is when a chair asks you a question, flip through your papers and see, take like 5 minutes to read what an argument of the team has said. Just have a different paper beside your already like primary note-taking paper. And in that paper is when you write like in very concise points for teams argument 1, argument 2, argument 3, and then the rebuttals on the side. Like if the rebuttal has been made, if the rebuttal has not been made. It's a paper that you keep on your side to basically remind you of exactly what is in your paper. And it's a paper in which you also write down necessarily the impact. So it can be as much as, so depending upon your writing speed, depending upon what you can manage, you can do that. The way in which I initially started is I used to use that paper to write down what exactly I think the clashes are within the debate and what arguments fall under what clashes. So I used to write down the question, and I used to write down this argument is in this clash, this argument falls under this clash. It just makes it a lot more simpler for you in panel discussions when you're trying to discuss why, A, what do you think the clashes are within the debate? Secondly, what arguments fall under what clashes? Thirdly, why do you think one team wins over the other? Try to be as concise as possible, but also be like, make sure that your reasoning is not rushed because of that, because you still need those scores if you do want to chair the next round, if you do want to do well at whatever tournament that you're doing at. So that's it for panel discussions. And that's kind of it for the presentation. So if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them like right now.
Yeah, many chairpersons do not reveal their rankings as a measure for not to influence the panelists. How should I, as a panel, like go into consideration while I'm marking the chair who does not reveal their ranking?
I mean, the chairs probably wouldn't reveal the rankings. I think they shouldn't also. The reason for that is if the panelists in most cases are people who either, let's say, in most cases, if you're talking about more generally, it's people who aren't necessarily like on the spectrum of, let's say, experience, honestly, as experience in terms of adjudication. So if you do that to novices, and if you tell novices, oh, this is my ranking that like, I gave a first to X, I gave a second to Y, I gave a third to Z, I gave a fourth to B. And if they're completely radically opposite rankings, which happens way more often than people do think, at that particular point of time, it's a lot more intimidating for them to just be like, oh, my ranking is like completely different. So it's okay for like chairs to not reveal the rankings. Once you reveal the rankings, the chair will tell you what the rankings are. And then you can perhaps have a discussion in terms of where do you differ in terms of like the teams. Can you please repeat case 1 from the extension part? Case 1 from the extension part, which was? Okay. Yeah, I remember. Yeah. So the case, 2 cases under which you perhaps like, let's say, you can exemplify how you may deal with extensions. First case is a team's given you, let's say, a premise, and a team's given you an impact, and they've just given you different sort of reasoning. Versus a second case where the team has given you it's the same premise as the opening. It's probably, let's say, the same reason to a certain extent, but then they go on to like deviate that reason into telling you as to why a different stakeholder is impacted and as to why a different stakeholder is more important in the debate. You'd probably give the debate to like the second case and not the first one. Because this first one, although it has additional reasoning, doesn't essentially do a lot in terms of bringing value to the debate. And there, since the value contribution isn't there, it becomes difficult for you to then give them credit, because in terms of individual contribution to the debate, in terms of making the debate better, in terms of bringing new content to the debate, although they have extensions, the extensions aren't relevant. The extensions aren't perhaps like the most important thing. That's why. Yeah, so I'll quickly just cover over the last thing that we want to talk about here as well. That is panel discussions in terms of chairs, in terms of like how you best as a chair manage a panel discussion. So if you think about a BP debate, you have, let me just do the permutations well. You have 6 clashes within the BP debate, right? So you have the opening half, you have both the benches, you have the closing, and then you have the diagonals. It's 6. Yeah. You need to, in a panel discussion, talk about all 6 clashes. If like on the if let's say everything goes well, if it's the worst case, the radical rankings are completely different. You talk about 6 clashes, and it's really difficult for you to manage time because the OC is probably pressuring you to send in the ballots as quickly as possible, and the tap team's doing that too. How do you then go on to, let's say, chair in the most convenient manner, or in the most let's say efficient manner? The way in which I do it is just write down whatever your rankings are, write down what the panel's rankings are, and see exactly where the differences occur in terms of those rankings. See, for example, do the opening halves match, do the closing halves match. Where you see that the team is perhaps winning it over, meaning it doesn't have to be exactly the same, the first and second doesn't have to be the same, but just check where a team A is winning over team B. Even if it's first and third on their end and first and second on your end, that's still similar rankings because you both agree that team A wins over team B. Then you perhaps look at the other extensions. Why does team B not win over team C in their paper? Why does it win over your paper? That perhaps is a more important question that you have to answer at the end of this panel discussion. And that's what the discussion should be focused upon. So usually be very smart in terms of choosing exactly what sort of clashes you want to talk about. Once you've picked those clashes and once you've chosen those clashes, then perhaps go on to talk about why those clashes are perhaps, let's say, important, why perhaps the panel A has given it to a certain team versus you, and then try to see if you can perhaps change your reasonings, or if you want to split completely from that, that is also fine within debates. That is something that people can also do. You don't always have to change your rankings one person or the other. So rather than taking 40 minutes, just come to a conclusion as soon as possible. and do go over every single clash that you feel is different. And as soon as they've changed the rankings, as soon as the panelist says, or the chair says that I agree with you, I'm going to change my rankings, at that particular point of time, flip it at the, like on the paper that you're taking notes, just flip those rankings completely. That is, just exchange positions of them. So if they concede to the point that opening government wins over closing government, then you change those rankings. At the end of the entire discussion, when you compare, let's say, multiple clashes, and when you sort out all the mess, like when you sort out all the mess in terms of what exactly in what ways is your ranking different from the other person, at the end, you'd probably have the same rankings. So it doesn't matter. So just be really smart in terms of what discussions do you choose to take and where do you choose to like have your point. And also don't be afraid of a panelist taking way too long to answer a certain question, to tell them that, hey, we're really short on time. If you can summarize it as quickly as possible. I feel like a lot of chairs are like, a lot of adjudicators themselves are really nice and they don't want to interrupt people and they don't want to interrupt like thought flows. But it's also important for you to have, let's say, a fruitful discussion when it comes to the entire debate. You can't do that if you're only, let's say, fixated upon one particular clash and not the others. Adjudicator scores sometimes get tanked unfairly by teams that are not happy with the end result, apart from tightening the OA to ensure that one is indeed a comprehensive OA. Is there anything else that you do recommend? First, the reason that teams perhaps don't give you the rankings that they want to is because they aren't entirely convinced upon the idea that they should have perhaps lost to the other team. The way in which you can ensure that is break the debate down into clashes, give them literally how you went through the debate, talk about what exactly is the first question within the debate, what are the teams given under that first question, what exactly are the other two questions, and what teams are given in there. Once you have the clashes sorted out, talk about what do you think is the most perhaps important clash within the debate, depending upon the extent of debate that's happened upon that topic, or it being extremely, let's say, crude, extremely central to the motion that is being debated at hand, or talking about like the scale of impact. Once you tell them that this is what I think is the most important part of the debate was, and this is why it becomes extremely important for me to judge the debate upon this, then perhaps then it becomes a lot more easier for teams to buy, to say that, okay, cool, I understand now that the adjudicator wanted to talk about like the second clash or the third clash, and this is why it's extremely important. So it's easier for them to also understand that the next time they perhaps come and try to debate certain motions or about these specific motions, to what to keep in mind. I think the reason that you get scored low, or like an adjudicator team decides to score someone low, is because A, they either don't understand why they lost the debate, because of which it becomes difficult for them. Secondly, they don't know what they can do to be better next time. An adjudicator never tells them that this is why you lost the debate. This is how, if you would have perhaps done this, and I would have given you the debate. So they don't know what they could have done differently. Thirdly, some people are just assholes, honestly. This is being recorded, right? I can't say assholes. Can I? I don't know.
Yeah,
But
you can. This is pretty informal. Yep.
Okay. Fun. Look, now I want to test out what I can say and what I can't. Really interesting. You can. So I don't know if I can say that, but just understand the fact that some people will always just be really mean. Some people will give you scores based on, let's say, your rep and stuff. There's nothing that you can do about it. So all that we can do in terms of like from adjudicators, in terms of basically making sure that teams don't essentially give you the worst kind of scores, is to ensure that you give your OAs in the best perhaps way possible. That is, make sure that you cover all clashes in the debate and let's say you leave out no scope in terms of them having any doubts. Secondly, in terms of like individual teams, you're very comprehensive in terms of saying that this is what the entire debate from between the two teams boiled down to. These are the questions that I considered. These are the questions that are more important for me. These are the questions that are less important for me. And this is why I think the debate should have gone the way that it did. I hope that answers your question. So if you're afraid that like teams might like mark you based upon identity markers, that is, some teams perhaps, because if you go to, let's say, international tournaments, you being brown might play a factor, or being an NCM plays a factor in terms of how teams mark you. On those cases, there are like CAPs do ensure in most cases that things are fair. They see trends in terms of what perhaps demographics are being marked in what way, especially at big tournaments where you have, let's say, a lot of this playing out. And even for, let's say, a lot of tournaments, we do drop scores when it comes to, let's say, NCM debaters and stuff. just to ensure that, let's say, things are fair. If there is a trend of, let's say, a certain debater just being marked low, or there's a score which is the complete outliner, in most cases, CAP panel is able to deal with that. So you shouldn't perhaps have to worry about it. But in terms of what you can do, it's probably in terms of, like, say, better OAs and essentially more comprehensive ideas in terms of why teams for the debate. It is advisable strategy to track a debate in OA in this way, talking about fourth, telling why it lost to third, second and first, then comparing third to second and first, and so on. Sure, but I personally find this extremely difficult to do. And the reason for that is, say I'm comparing, say the team that came first is closing government, and the team that came second is opening opposition. First thing that I need to do here is I still need to tell you what the extensions coming from closing governments were, meaning I still have to do the comparison when it comes to closing government and opening government. That's one extra clash that you now have to do, which isn't in your rankings. So although while your rankings sound, let's say it's comparing, let's say, third to second or third to first, I still need to do one extra particular thing where I have to tell you what the extensions are. Then I need to also tell you what exactly were perhaps the issues that came up in the opening opposition speech, and why those issues are really important within the debate. For that, I perhaps also have to reference towards what exactly is the debate that happened in the opening half, and what questions just stick out the most, and why are these questions so much more relevant within the debate. So that's another class that I have to do just to justify the first and second ranking. So although you can do that, and of course you're welcome to experiment as much as you can, personally for me, that's not the most efficient way in which I can perhaps give an away. But if you can do that, that's absolutely fine. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
Perfect. Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, one more. How to mark wings when they resort to a voting, like when they are dissenting against a particular thing, and like how to consider their reasoning against yours, and how to logically weigh in debate or a panel deliberation when they tend to vote against your ranking or a particular clash.
Yeah, the first thing that to do is just not be angry. That's the default thing to do. Just not be mad that they've dissented. Just not be mad that they've rolled you over. Probably think about where exactly does the difference lie between your reasoning and their reasoning. That usually is this one or two things that they buy more than you do. Sometimes it's the characterization. Sometimes is you didn't buy an argument because the team haven't essentially expounded upon the reasonings enough, but they did. So figure that out in terms of, like, where does a difference occur? If that difference is reasonable, which happens in close debates, where, like, you're likely to buy it either way, right? You're likely to be like, it's a very marginal thin line where you're like, in some debates, I might buy the characterization. In some other debates, like if I can understand why they haven't bought it, then you give them like a fair score, right? Because then you're like, the adjudicator bought this more than this. I still think that's like bad adjudication, and because of which I deduct, let's say, 1 or 2 scores. But I still think they're a good adjudicator, because they do have reasons as to why they reached their verdict. If they have reasons to why they reached the verdict, they deserve a fair score. If you think that they don't do enough of a reason, if they've just bought arguments that are very difficult to buy, and they've not essentially given enough credit to one team or the other, there's not been like a decent adjudicator in your opinion, then you mark them low, then you give them the score that they perhaps deserve. But it's important to think that you don't give them a score just because they've dissented. You give them a score based upon the kind of reasoning that they gave, or the kind of, let's say, reason that they gave. So you always, first of all, just don't think what your reasonings were, or don't recall, like, it's just important for you to just ignore your part in this entire thing, and just to think about their case in isolation, and what they said, does that make sense? Could you have done that if you were on the other side? If yes, then you probably score them fairly. You still score them fairly, but then you give them a higher score. If not, then you give them, let's say, a lower score, depending upon whatever you feel their education ability is. How you go with a call? Do you compare other clashes and tell them the impact of the arguments and claims at the end of the reveal rankings? The way in which I go on with rankings is I start off with telling them as to how I felt about the debate. So I give them as to my structure of the debate. I tell them that I'm going to give you general comments first, and give you what the real rankings of the rankings second. I'm going to give you reasons as to why the rankings are the way they are. And lastly, we're going to talk about constructives if we have time. Then I tell them what exactly are the general comments within the debate. usually I found this like in 90% of the debates, I'm talking about weighing, or I'm talking about basically giving me better impacts, or I'm talking about being a lot more competitive within their own argumentation, that is being like contesting the other, whatever you feel that the room has been lacking, that if these things that the room had, they would do a lot better. And the reason this is important to do is sometimes you don't have a lot of time to give constructives. So it's always a good idea to just give like basic constructives out there to ensure that the teams at least know that, okay, this is perhaps we work on this, we can do better right the next round. Sometimes you don't have time between rounds. So it's always better for the teams. It's better for you because it sets up some sort of credibility in terms of saying that, sure, you understand the debate, you understand exactly what happens within the rooms, you understand things that go on, and therefore the teams are just willing to listen to you a lot more. But primarily it's to like ensure that the teams do essentially get at least some sort of constructive. Usually in the end, you don't have time. Then you talk about what your rankings are. That is, I tell them, for example, opening government first, opening opposition second, closing government third, closing opposition fourth. Then I start with my rank, the reasons to why it is. I start with the opening half, tell them as to why OG or OO wins over one another. I bring in closing government, tell them exactly what the extensions coming in from closing government were, what the extensions relevant, to what extent do I buy those extensions. Once I've done that, I tell them, then I do the bench comparison. That is to say that I tell them why closing government perhaps wins over their opening, if they're able to do that, or if they lose out against their own opening. Then I do the diagonal. That is, I say why closing government wins or loses against opening opposition. So I've done for three teams. I've done the entire thing within the first, say, 10 minutes, like within the first, let's say 7 minutes. The only team to like expound upon now is the closing opposition. You bring closing opposition, the same drill all over again. You talk about closing opposition's extensions, you compare them to opening opposition, and then you compare them to both the government teams. That's how I go on with the rankings. So I reveal the rankings after I'm done with the feedback for the team, for the room. But then you can feel free to experiment and change around. None of these are like hard and fast rules. The way in which I came up on the way in which I do stuff is, it's just trial and error. I saw what worked for me and what didn't. There are plenty of incredible adjudicators out there who do things completely differently. And it just depends upon what you're comfortable with and what you feel okay doing. Anything else? You can unmute and ask questions as well. That's completely fine with me at this point. Perfect. Seeing no questions. Okay. Could you please just once again repeat the 2 questions in the short diagonal apart from burdens? 2 questions in the short diagonal. This is why you need proper presentations. Because what are the 2 questions that I talked about in the diagonal? First is just talking about if the teams perhaps win out against the other teams in terms of the burdens of the layout. Secondly, is measuring against, like by measuring contribution of one team against the other, that is to see if it's a contribution of that team, like the individual contribution that they make, does it really let's trump over the questions that were brought up by the team in the opening? The way in which you measure if a team has been able to fulfill the burden or not, either they're able to, let's say, if the team has brought up an X side layer in terms of saying that we benefit X stakeholder, then the 2 questions that you can ask in this particular case is to say that from opposition is to say that has opposition able to nullify that sort of, let's say, the impact that they've gone. If they haven't been able to nullify, if they haven't been able to mitigate that, then secondly, are they able to give that particular stakeholder better alternatives, like better world in terms of things that in terms of like their own counterfactual. If they haven't been able to also tell you that the stakeholder, they've given a better world to the stakeholders, then thirdly, have they been able to tell me as to why the stakeholder is not as important in the debate and why that particular stakeholder, like why something else should prioritize a lot more. If they haven't done all of these 3 things, and if the opening team has spent like a significant amount of time or really talked about in depth about as to why they benefit a certain stakeholder and why the sort of stakeholder is important, then by default, they can't win that particular burden. So then you do the same sort of analysis in terms of us answering what clashes happen in the diagonals in terms of like other classes, like what sort of clashes are important. Once you're able to like decide for yourself, that is, if the teams answer the burdens, they're able to show better impacts. If they've been able to, like in terms of the clashes, in terms of the most important questions in the debate, if they're able to answer that, then they would deserve the win of the other team. How to consider mark engagement via POI, especially diagonals. Again, another controversial idea. Some Adjs use POI as an extremely important marker of engagement when it comes to diagonal, like teams in the diagonals, where they will perhaps, let's say, score the other team lower because of the idea of that, oh, you didn't really engage with the POI. Personally, for me, I think at a point at which we allow people to, let's say, not take POIs, and unlike HWS, if you don't have, let's say, hard and fast rules in terms of taking POIs or not taking POIs, I usually, let's say that a POI is being offered, that might reflect in the speaker score of the team. If the team hasn't perhaps taken the POI, even though POIs continues to be offered, even if they were able to take the POI, but it doesn't really pay into that extensively into my reasoning as to why the reasons are the way they are. The reason for that is, I think while openings don't really know what closings are going to run, the reason in which the way in which you can build, like the way in which like opening, the burdens that are existing upon opening is to also be preemptive in terms of their argumentation, is to also essentially be able to show that the case that we're running is probably benefiting stakeholder in probably all cases, and also essentially be able to perhaps tell you as to what the likely extensions from its closing are as to why they still trump it. If they aren't able to do that, and if they're like really losing in coming in from, let's say, closing, then it becomes the idea then becomes about will that POI, is that POI extensionally like, is that important like for them to win the debate? At a point at which the rules don't say that the closings perhaps have to take a POI at this particular point of time, I can't reflect that into my reasoning in terms of my OA as to, oh, the closing perhaps lost a debate because they didn't answer a POI. I think that just would be really unfair, honestly, given that openings had 2 constructive speeches, closing already has 1. So in most cases, I don't take that into consideration. I do take that into consideration in terms of like speaker scores and stuff. That is the speaker really the best sort of speaker if the speaker repeatedly like stopped engaging with the other team in terms of like POIs and stuff. So that's where you can reflect it. But again, it depends from adjudicator to adjudicator. Some of them place an extremely high emphasis upon it, others don't. I think there just needs to be like a standardization of, let's say, a rule. It says that you at least need like WSDC, where you tell them that take at least 1 POI. Once you don't do that, it's just difficult. But personally, for me, it's not that big of a deal unless in speaker scores. Any other questions?
If not, we can stop this recording, I guess.
Yeah, we can. Thank you